Knight and Changeling by Emrys the Merlin. Chapter 1. Lost but Found. Jen was in shock. She had no idea what was happening as the group of knights collected what they could of their fallen, picking up shields that were torn and scorched from the dead. Sir George stepped over to her, pulling his cloak off his shoulders. "Here, young changeling." He wrapped it around her and closed the clasp around her neck. "You seem shocked." Jen stared at him. "I have no idea how I even got here." George nodded, bright blue eyes, kind and understanding. "Many things have happened in recent days that we have no explanation for. The men believe the swordsmith sent you." Jen glanced down at the sword that hung by the knight's side. On the hilt was set what looked like a solid stone, but within it was the symbol of the Omnitrix, the symbol of the plumbers, the Ultimatrix symbol. Jen glanced down at her wrist where the Ultimatrix sat. George frowned slightly. "You say your name is Jen?" Jen nodded, distracted. "My full name is Jennifer, but my friends call me Jen." George nodded. "Lady Jennifer, do you know how to ride?" Jen frowned at him. She noticed a younger boy leading two horses up to them. "No, that's something I never learned how to do." George nodded and held out his hands to her. "May I assist you, then?" Jen looked over him. "I don't really have a choice, do I?" George frowned. "You have my word that you will not be harmed. As a knight of Albion, honor means everything to me. You shall not be harmed." Jen frowned and held out her hands to him. He scooped her up and set her side saddle on the steed before mounting the horse behind her. Jen had seen horses in petting zoos when she was a kid, but this was nothing like those. This horse was massive, a war charger nearly twice the size of the horses she'd seen before. She had no idea where to hang on to the creature. She had no idea how she'd even gotten here. The last thing she remembered was Gwen chanting something in a magical language after one of those slimy green creatures had taken control of her. Had Gwen done this? Jen closed her eyes as George took the reins and urged the horse into a trot. George regarded his charge with a critical eye. She could be no older than his daughter had been when she had died at the flames of the Dagon, 16 at most. But her hair was oddly short, her clothes strange. He'd never seen a woman in trousers before, much less ones that tight. He shook his head slightly as they made their way through the carnage the Dagon had left behind. They were many miles away from the castle yet, and several of the buildings here were still smoldering. He had but wounded the Dagon before it had struck its blow against him. She had healed him with a touch. Her skin had been shimmering like cut stone with small stars shimmering in her skin, the same green as the short tunic she wore as a human girl, the same color as her eyes and the swordsmith's symbol. A few of the knights were already whispering that she was a creation of the Fey Smiths, like the sword itself. He wasn't so sure. But as they arrived at the castle, it was clear that she had never seen a town or castle. Despite the hollow look in her eyes, she looked upon the world with the innocence of a child. He helped her down from the horse. Several of the servants stepped forward. George nodded to one of the women. "Take Lady Jennifer here to change into something more suitable to greet the king, please, Catherine. I believe my daughter's clothes will fit her well enough." Catherine nodded, stepping up to Jennifer. She was an older maid who had once served George's wife and daughter, trustworthy to a fault. She regarded the strange girl, but curtsied and nodded, taking her by the hand and leading her away. The king's squire had come out to meet him. George nodded to him. "I must speak to his majesty as soon as possible. This girl's appearance is a sign that we must advance our steps against the creature and the demons that control them." The squire bowed and hurried off. Jen still wasn't sure what was going on, but since Paradox hadn't shown up to take her home yet, she had no choice but to go with whatever this was. If he didn't, she had no idea how she would get home. She was ushered into a large chamber by the woman, Catherine. She looked her over and clicked her tongue. "You're a strange one, but if you are to meet the king, Then we must make you presentable. Come now, off with these strange clothes while I fetch you something more suitable. Jen frowned, but the woman was insistent. In what felt like no time, she was laced into a literal corset. It wasn't as uncomfortable as it seemed in all the movies, but it was a bit tight. The skirt was large and long, so long that Jen was nearly afraid she would trip on it. It was a dusty blue with pearls trimming it. There was a darker blue overlay that was also trimmed in pearls. The blouse matched the underskirt with lace and pearls as well. The sleeves were large, which was lucky because, as she stated multiple times, the Ultimatrix did not come off. Catherine ran a brush through her short hair and tutted again, fixing a blue veil in her hair to cover the back of her neck. By the time Sir George knocked on the door, Jen felt thoroughly ridiculous. But he smiled and bowed slightly. He offered her an arm. "My lady, the king has granted you a place here, in the palace under my tutelage. We believe you were sent to assist us in this war of ours against the creature who besieges our land. A blessing sent from the Fae who forged Ascalon." She nodded, but kept silent. She had figured out what was happening now. The journal she had found with Kai almost a year ago was this knight's journal, the same Sir George. The changeling who had appeared so recently in his writings was her. That was clear now. What wasn't clear was how all of this would end for her. According to Gregory, the changeling from the story had vanished after the Dagon was defeated. Whatever happened now, it seemed that she was in this until she found a way home, or until Paradox came to get her. But she wasn't really looking forward to fitting in here. She just wished she'd had time to read further in his journal. Chapter 2. Training begins. The king greeted her warmly, but spoke more to Sir George than to her. "You will take all responsibility for the changeling, Sir George." George nodded and bowed. Jen curtsied awkwardly, following his lead. The king looked her over with a critical eye. "You appear to have your work cut out for you." George bowed again and led Jen off before she could tell the king just what she thought of that, which was probably for the best. It took a few weeks for them to fall into a routine and a compromise. Jen did not like the clothes very much, but the traditions would not allow her to return to her normal clothes, so they compromised, with skirts an inch shorter than would be usually permissible, and without the petticoats that were the fashion of the day, which made training much easier. George seemed to have made it his goal to teach Jen everything he knew of combat as quickly as possible. "Again," he said, swirling a sword as Jen scrambled to her feet, snatching up her own weapon. It was difficult, to say the least. Jen hadn't worked with bladed weapons before. She had worked with guns but never blades. She was getting decent with a sword after several weeks of intensive practice. It helped that she had some combat training from Grandpa Max. Surprisingly, she was much better with knives than she was with full sword. George nodded as she threw another of the daggers into the target. "Very nice." Jen raised an eyebrow at him as she flipped the dagger in her hand. "Did you teach your daughter how to do this?" she asked as she tossed the blade at the target. It sank into it near the center. George frowned slightly. "It isn't common for young women to learn combat, even the daughters of knights." Jen rolled her eyes. "But I will admit I showed her a few things. She did not have your talent with blades, though, nor, of course, your ability to transform." Jen nodded. Over the last month or so, she'd kept her mouth shut on details of where she came from and who she really was. She had no idea how much she might mess up the future if she revealed anything. But she'd confirmed a few of her suspicions. George was indeed Sir George, the knight who owned the journal that she and Kai had found. There was no sign of the green journal yet, but Jen wasn't sure she wanted it to show up. But she couldn't help but wonder if Stardust's reaction to the book had been because it was her mana sealing it, in the future for her, but the past for the book. The best she could make of it was that it was as close to a paradox as things would get without breaking reality. Maybe that was why Professor Paradox had yet to show up to take her home, as he had when she'd accidentally trapped herself in Rex's world. George called a halt to their practicing for lunch. One of the servants brought them out a lunch on the training field. They ate mostly in silence, but after a while, George turned to her. "You never speak of home. Do you have others of your kind waiting for you when the Dagon is defeated? Jen shrugged. She had no idea what was happening back home. She'd been gone a full month. There was no telling what was happening back home. In her first few days, the Ultimatrix had reset again, claiming an interrupted connection to Primus, meaning that even when she transformed, she was stuck in the medieval clothes she'd been forced into since first appearing here. The outfit wasn't too objectionable, though, a plain green dress with black trim that reminded her very much of the girl from the tapestry. It turned out that Azimuth was way older than Jen had ever realized, since he was apparently around now, as was his most fond creation. Primus was a manufactured planet that held the codon stream, which served to hold a sample of every being's DNA that Azimuth knew of. She wouldn't be surprised if he was out there somewhere in the stars starting work on the Omnitrix. She had no way of knowing, though. Her communicator was useless, the tech inside it too advanced for the current tech of whatever plumbers may or may not be in the area. Even if they were, how could they help? She shook her head. I hope I do, but I don't know. George nodded, slightly looking contemplative, as they finished their meal. He stood and held out a hand to her. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. Come with me. We have several things we need from the market. Jen nodded. She was practically accompanied everywhere here, which really she couldn't blame them for. But George sort of reminded her of her father with his overprotective streak. It made her heart twist. She hadn't really said goodbye to her parents before she vanished. Her mother was probably storming the plumber base in search of her by now. She sighed as she followed George to the market. She was unpleasantly surprised to learn that they were shopping for a horse. For Jen. If you are to accompany me on the hunt for the creature, you must learn to ride. I will leave you in the capable hands of the stable master. He will help you find a suitable mare. I have a few more things I need. The stable master was a stubborn old man who didn't listen to Jen in the slightest. He seemed to think he knew best about everything, but none of the mares he suggested could keep up with the war chargers the knights rode. Jen rolled her eyes. She'd be better off just running as Accelerate. But one of the stable hands found the solution. A pure black charger, younger than the other war horses, but much more patient. He was thought to be of too kind a temper to be a war horse, but after feeding him a few apples and getting a lesson in saddling from the stable hand Joff, she managed to mount the horse. Very good, milady, you're a natural. Encouraged, Joff encouraged from where he sat at the edge of the pen, ready to leap in and assist her at any moment, should it prove necessary. Honestly, it was sort of like riding a motorcycle that had a mind of its own. Gentle applause came from the other side of the pen. George stood there, nodding. He is right. You are quite talented. Can you bring him over here? Jen nodded and carefully guided the steed over to the fence, with only one minor stop. George nodded again, and Jen spotted a few wrapped packages under his arm. Joff, help her down. Joff scaled the fence, but Jen managed to get herself down before he could intervene. Thanks, but I can do that myself. George shook his head, but at this point he was mostly used to her stubbornness. What will you call him? Jen patted the horse again, feeding him another apple. Philip. A strong name for a strong horse, miss, Joff said, grinning and taking the reins as George handed a bag of silver to the horsemaster. Jen grinned, running a hand through her hair, narrowly missing the string of pearls Catherine had forced into her hair that morning. Evening was beginning to set around them as they made their way back to the castle. As he did every night, George escorted her to her rooms. They were just off of the knight's own rooms. She had a feeling they had also been his daughters when she was alive. Tomorrow we must attempt to find the creature. Jen nodded. There had been no new sightings of the Dagon since she'd appeared and helped the knights drive it off. If Jen wanted to get home any time soon, she had to find the Dagon as soon as possible.